Well, thanks for coming along tonight, folks, to hear both Mark Goodwin and Carl Scully make first appearances at the Sydney Institute on the occasion of the recent launch of their book, The Cronulla Riots, The Inside Story. Now, I should make the point that this book was launched in Sydney in September in Parliament House here with launched by the Lebanese Australian barrister Stephen Stanton. So what we're doing is a second function in Sydney tonight, and copies of the book are available. I'll introduce our two speakers in accordance to where they were, what positions they held when what happened in the book occurred. So Mark Goodwin was Assistant Commissioner of the New South Wales Police, and Carl Scully was the Minister for Police in the New South Wales Labor government. So we're going to start off with Mark, we go to Carl, then we go to questions discussion. Mark, off you go.
Thank you very much, Gerard, and certainly Anne, and to ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for the invite to speak at the Sydney Institute. It's a great, rare privilege, and we're honoured to do so. So thank you. The intro has already been given, but my name's Mark Goodwin, and my role during the Cronulla Riots, I was the actual police commander for it all. And to my right, Carl Scully was the police minister at the time. So two very instrumental law enforcement roles, or the most law enforcement roles at the time. So we've broken our talk tonight into two parts. So firstly, I'll be talking about the actual build-up to the riot and the riot itself and the revenge attacks that you may be somewhat familiar with, but wait and see. And then Carl will talk about what we talk about as three misnomers, the Cronulla race riots, and I won't spoil the thunder in respect of those three what we say are misnomers. So Cronulla, we all know Cronulla's on the south side of Sydney, beachside suburb. It's interestingly the only suburb in Sydney with a train line, so it does have a lot of accessibility from other areas of Sydney in the western suburbs. And that has meant that over the years, right dating back to the 50s and 60s, there's been problems on the beach down there between visitors and locals and who owns the beach and spatial domain and all those sorts of issues. So, in the 50s and 60s, there was groups like the Rockers and Sharpies, and then later the Westies, meaning western suburbs of Sydney, or Bankies for Bankstown. And I see get a few laughs out of that. And then those sort of fights carried on, and then in the early 2000s, we had a newcomer to the beach down there, which were young Arabic Muslim men. And there was absolutely no difference in the issues that occurred earlier in the 50s, 60s, 70s and right through those decades to what occurred with some gangster-like behaviour by these Arabic young men. So there was differences in dress, cultural mores, mannerisms, behaviour. There was some gang-style offensive conduct, attempts to dominate the spatial domain down there, incivility, male preening, misogynistic behaviour towards females, verbal and physical altercations took place, disrespect of the locals in their eyes, and litter left all over the beach at the end of the day by these visitors. So in the 70s, 60s, 50s, it was F off Rockers, F off Westies. And in the early 2000s, it became F off Lebs. So that then became labelled racist. But we look in our book, was that really racist? Was that an example of underlying racism in Australia, or was there more to it in terms of this behaviour, which were the real causal factors that led up to it? And we take a deep look, and Carl will talk more on this during his talk. So was it the sole cause of the riots was racism, or was there a deeper underlying issues? So back to the beach and the behaviour that caused the angst in the lead up, and I'll talk about the build up to the riot now. Of a weekend, there was groups of young Middle Eastern men from the western suburbs were coming to the beach at that time, and no different than the way skinheads were dressed, different groups were dressed. These young men were dressed in, not in beachwear, but in things like designer tracksuits with buzzcut hairstyles and dripping with jewellery and flash fancy cars. And in fact, a lot of these young men were gangsters, and they were very well known to the police in the western suburbs. And I very much stress that they were not at all representative of the wider respectful culture that they actually came from, who have been stigmatised and labelled by their behaviour. And interestingly, in the book, we interview a lot of people who draw that to our attention and want that very much emphasised. So they came to the beach, escaping the hotter western suburbs, and also to get away from police who were targeting him in their own areas. And they were there to dominate and assert their way, intimidate and impress the skippy girls. And back home, there was their own women from their own culture were dressed head to toe, but on the beach there was these bikini-clad girls, and they acted like gangsters, and they strutted them all in packs, and they intimidated passers-by. And there was misogynistic comments, really bad ones, and I only just mentioned some, like, have you sucked the Lebanese cucumber, and have you tasted Lebanese honey, and all these sort of comments being made to young girls, which completely enraged the local parents of the area. But none of this has been reported over the years, or very little of it, which we say has somewhat skewed the outcome of the blame and where it lies and what really led up to it. So the flashpoint, as we all know, was the assault on the lifeguards down there. And the local media portrayed that as an assault of the Aussie icon, shock horror. It's been a bashing of our sons of Anzacs, and people might remember the headlines. These people volunteer their time on our beaches of a summer to save your lives. They've been assaulted by the Arabic Muslims, and it was fanned, that media rode those and flamed those fans of racial discontent in the week-long build-up to the riot, to a point where white supremacists and patriot groups started coming to the area at Cronulla. Spruikers were handing out pamphlets, and this then led to mass text messaging, and there was literally hundreds of thousands of texts that circulated to attend the beach at Cronulla, to reclaim the beach on the day. And there was really bad texts circulating on both sides about, and they're in our book as the exact description of what each wanted to do to each other, which was pretty horrendous. So on the day of the riot, it was a Sunday, the 11th of December, about 5,000 people gathered on Cronulla Beach. It was predominantly young white males, and police were very well prepared for a very high-risk potential public order event. But the reality is, which you don't see in the media, is that actually most of the day, it was like Australia Day used to be down at Cronulla. So there's barbecues, there's flag waving, there's the singing of the national anthem and We'll Sing Matilda. The local surf club, in fact, launched a surf boat in the middle of all this, and it was like a carnival-like atmosphere. There were no real crowd leaders, there was no direction or purpose, and they were there to make a statement that we're here to take back the beach. But again, none of this is reported. Why? Did it not suit the agenda? So I'll leave you with that. Then jacked up big utes started to arrive with Eureka stockade flags in the back windows, and white supremacist spruikers got out of those utes. They were not local, and they played up to the cameras and spread throughout the crowd. And you'll see on the front of our book, actually, there is one of these white supremacist spruikers there with he's got a bandana on with red, white and blue and stars and stripes, and his arms are in the air. And we looked at this photo and thought it was appropriate for the front of our book, because 90% of the day, that's what the actual incident looked like. There was the cops watching the rubberneckers, and the rubberneckers watching the spruikers, who were there to cause trouble, and they were hardcore. So as the day wore on, alcohol, the lovely alcohol took over, and the drunken youth there, then with the spruikers, they started chants in the crowd, and then it turned into what we've all seen: poor behaviour, mob violence, assaults on Middle Eastern people, and utter disgraceful behaviour. The worst of which was at Cronulla railway station, where this false rumour went through the crowd that there was Middle Eastern men coming from the western suburbs on the train, and they needed to be stopped, and so hundreds of people ran to the railway station. Some got on the train there and started assaulting two young Middle Eastern boys that had absolutely nothing to do with it. I don't think they even knew what was on at Cronulla, which was disgraceful. And I think the images of the big sergeant, Craig Campbell, with his baton wielding through the train and taking out half the carriage and then clearing the entire platform by himself is certainly seared in Australian history, and one we'll all remember. Interestingly, We interview him in the book, and he calls his baton Milo. So we were like, okay, so why is it you call your baton Milo, Craig? He goes, it's marvellous what a difference Milo makes. So I thought I'd share that with you. But the big thing is that we strongly contest that the whole 5,000 crowd participated in this event, because of the beat up and build up to it. I think every journalist in Sydney had arrived on the day, and they were literally standing around. The looks on their face by half the day was palpable, because looked like they were going to be sacked when they went back to their editors, because they had nothing until the alcohol grabbed in. So these incidents, of which I think I counted on the train on the way in here, there were 9 incidents of the entire day, were filmed by dozens of cameras from every angle you can imagine. And then that night they were strung together in very quick succession with excited newsreader voiceovers, I should say, that then gave that impression that the entire 5,000 strong crowd acted like that all day long, which was absolutely false. When you spread those 9 incidents out, I was a police commander and I was there, and I think I saw 1 or 2 of these actually occur, scuffles in the crowd, and police were all over it straight away, and they're over like that. I mean, we're not standing here making excuses for the appalling behaviour that happened, but, you know, they talk about in America fake news. Is when we saw the news that night, we were astounded by how it had been manipulated to make it look like the entire Cronulla and the entire people that were there were white racists and had all participated in the event, which was not the case. So that then hit the news that night. And then that led to a series of frightening revenge attacks, tenfold worse than what happened on the day at Cronulla, that to this date, that most people do not even know what the police faced. So literally suburbs were being randomly targeted across Australia by groups of up to 50 cars full of Middle Eastern young men who were armed with baseball bats, knives, guns, and they were rampaging, marauding through entire streets, smashing car windows, shop windows, assaulting people with baseball bats. There were stabbings. And this went on in numerous suburbs such as Maroubra, Brighton, Les Sands, the Arncliffe, Ramsgate, so forth, Cronulla. And the worst of it certainly was within the first few days. But we had intelligence that would be frightening, and we reveal that in the book. A couple of the things that I'll disclose now are that we had intelligence there was to be a drive-by shooting the following weekend with Uzi submachine guns at the Northies Hotel at Cronulla. There was attempts being made on the black market to purchase a hand grenade, which was taken off the street that week in an undercover police operation, and another search warrant done with guns taken off the street. There was to be the Thursday night before Christmas, because this was all in the lead up to Christmas, there was to be a raid on the Westfields at Miranda, and 50 cars were going to pull up and rampage through the shopping centre there at Miranda, and we all saw what happened at Bondi with one offender. So goodness knows what would have been the situation there. But again, there's no imagery, and look, I will say to you this: Google Cronulla riots and look at images, and all you will see are the daytime events captured by the media there on the day. And then the narrative has been written over the years, and all blame attributed to what occurred there in the day, to the complete exclusion of, it seems, of what actually occurred in the build-up and also in these revenge attacks. So our book attempts to balance that out, and we give a very factual account. And I know that, academics and journalists and various terms and documentaries over the years have really focused on the daytime events there at Cronulla, but the reality is that, yes, that was difficult to police, but tenfold more difficult was the issues of the revenge attacks that took place that night. So much so that in my discussions with Police Minister Carl Scully, the intelligence that we had was so extreme that there was a special sitting of the New South Wales Parliament, and emergency laws were passed to give police powers to lock down areas, to demand identification, to have reasons why people were leaving and entering particular places or suburbs, confiscate phones and cars and all sorts of things. So, that is the greatest example of democracy and parliament in action I've ever seen, because we were operating with those powers within 4 days of the actual incidents on the beach at Cronulla. And it was a special recall of parliament. They'd finished for the year, they were gone, they were on holidays, so they came back. So that was a fantastic example of what can be achieved. And that is what made the difference. That and teams that we formed. We locked down these suburbs, but we also formed these teams which have been renowned in different jurisdictions all over the world, where we had 40 police, which were 10 pursuit car drivers in 10 V8 highway patrol cars with 30 riot police in each one of these teams, head-on attacking these marauding mobs in mobile riots that have never been seen really, that we know of anywhere else in the world. So it was a bit of a unique thing, and it has been mentioned in other jurisdictions. So I'll wrap it up there, but in conclusion, this is the first time that we know of that such a book or anything has been written by actual participants. It actually astounds us that the amount of material out there that Carl Scully and Mark Goodwin have never once been asked for an interview for any of the material that exists out there, whether those documentaries or academic articles, and it astounds me that we've never been asked. So this book, we hope, we sincerely hope, will be the go-to reference into the future. Thank you.
Carl Scully to discuss the events of late 2005.
Thank you very much, Commander. As always, we delivered. Thank you very much, Gerard and Anne, for the invitation to be here. Very much appreciated. Mark's given a terrific background to what happened, the lead up, the revenge attacks, and a very quick outline of the police response, which was a crushing and quelling of dissent and a restoration of peace and order to the streets of Sydney in a way that I think people don't fully appreciate. As he outlined, 3 misnomers: Cronulla, race, riot. I'm going to deal with all 3 because they're, in our view, inaccurate. Cronulla, you heard Mark talk about the places that disorder emanated and unfolded across Sydney. When I think 16 days before the Cronulla riots, the Paris riots of 2005 unfolded. In a suburb, Clichy-sous-Bois, 2 men hiding from police were electrocuted, spread across Paris. But here, it also spread, admittedly, a major event of some consequence in one place. But the revenge attacks were all across Sydney, and we still get the Cronulla riots as if, and it aids and abets the notion that not much else happened. The question of riot, this is interesting. Just whenever there's a conflict and there's a bloody nose and a cop car shaken and a couple of broken windows and a few protesters, journalists on the scene coined the term riot. Has to be a riot. We called it such, and it usually sticks. Now, this event, in terms of our history, you'd say was a riot. But I just point out, relative to what's happened around the world in the last 20 years in Africa, Europe, USA, the term is usually coined and used for almost insurrection levels of protest. Large numbers of people being killed, property damage that's almost of frightening levels, and buildings destroyed, troops in their thousands being called upon to restore order. Now, in terms of our own history, Bathurst riots in the mid-80s are probably worse. But if you have a look at the book, you'll see where we compare it. Some of the people we interviewed said it was more likely to be more accurately termed the Sydney breaches of the peace. Now, you might say breaches of the peace is not a significant enough term. That's because we're always comfortable throwing out the word riot. Someone chucked a bottle, ambulance got shaken, a window got broken, someone got punched, therefore it was a riot. So we question that. But what I really want to talk to you about, racism. I had another look at the SBS 2015 show. And Mark and I set out to write about what happened in the lead up and beyond from the two law enforcement participants. I can't tell you, I don't think the Commissioner minds me saying, Mark and I basically worked in tandem for weeks on end, and they won't mind if I say we basically ignored the senior command and we dealt directly because we had to. And that's another story. I had a guy that I knew that would respond to my expectations, so I dealt with him accordingly. But the coverage is so potently pervasive. When you look at it, it is shocking. It is shocking. Because you see what young men were doing. Appalling behaviour. But then we say, okay, does that then mean Sutherland Shire is an enclave of bogan Caucasian racists? Because that is the cheap explanation of what happened. And so I actually said to Mark a while ago, we should just write a chapter, what did the scholars say? Because we're writing all this descriptive stuff and we did an analysis of the inquiry into police performance. I actually said to him, let's have a look at what the scholars had to say. And I thought it might be interesting. They'd come up with some reasons and we already knew a lot about what had happened. The scholarship is not scholarship as you and I understand it. It's very woke, politically correct, and very assuming that Australia is a racist country full of Arab-hating people who live in the southern suburbs of Sydney. And these are peer-reviewed journals. I could pile them up, one after the other. And when you go through what was said and done, like the text message, this was the first time there were chain text messages in their tens of thousands, and we put them in the book. They are pretty offensive stuff on both sides, wishing to do harm to the other. And so the first point I ask is, let's challenge the notion that only Caucasians in this battle were racists. It doesn't stand up. When you see what happened and what the text messages were contained and the violence, it was pretty appalling, but you don't see any of this footage. So academics are human. So any of you, as Mark challenged, go home and Google the Cronulla riots. All you'll probably find, if you're lucky, is a few cars in Maroubra who had their windows broken and a couple of stories about people being bashed with a baseball bat or knifed. You won't see the footage. You'll see all this videography of one side. In fact, we went through scores of photographs to try and get something for the front cover. It was a challenge. So we say if there's one side's racist, so was the other. But then that then leads to an interesting question. If there was a hatred of the other from both sides, why did it come and go? Why did it never come back? It didn't make sense to us that the scholarship was effectively of no assistance to us, disappointingly. I thought it might be, but just didn't make sense. So we looked for something meaningful to explain this human behaviour. This crescendo, almost meteoric rise and flash and violence and awful stuff said and done, subside and gone. Now, a big part of the subsidence was the police crushing the dissent, but that didn't mean it wouldn't come back. If there is deep-seated hatred of the other, it will come back and endure. It didn't. So we drew on some research done by a political psychologist, Karen Stenner. Very interesting. And we found a useful explanation. And she talked about people being differencists, not racists. That what we search for is commonness and sameness. And this notion challenges how we celebrate multicultural Australia. because the consequences of her theory is that we've obviously got to acknowledge we're a multicultural society and we're very diverse, but work for what drives us together. What commonality do we have? Because her argument was it is when a tribe feels threatened that it reacts intolerantly. And it is intolerance to difference, not intolerance per se. Mark rightly pointed out about white supremacists. I'd say there may well have been some Arabic supremacists. But the threats to how they believe the world should function substantially explains what happened. Incivility, disrespect, misogyny. But there's also the cultural notion of how to behave in the beach space. We call it the towel versus the soccer ball. It doesn't mean right or wrong, just different. And so it's an interesting quote, which I might have time. Stenner, this is good, it's in our book, much intolerance of different races, beliefs and behaviours is driven primarily not by animosity toward any specific target, but rather by a fundamental and overwhelming desire to establish and defend some collective sense of oneness and sameness. That is, amongst our neighbours, far better to see what we have in common than highlight the difference. Now, that doesn't mean people who are intolerant to difference won't again behave in a politically, moral or racially deviant way. But it wasn't the reason for it. So a lot of folks find this hard to challenge. Someone says, what is a racist thing? You know, we grew here, you flew here, if Nulla, you know, yo, Cronulla, and equally the text messages on the other side. Of course they were racist. They were offensive. They were awful. But why were they doing it? And the person who launched our book, Gerard, gave a great line. He said, it may not have been racially inspired, but it was racially hijacked to put a badge on it. And interestingly, Karen Stenner also said, a good deal of what we call racial intolerance is not even primarily about race, let alone blacks and their purported shortcoming. My contention is that much of what we think of racism, likewise political and moral intolerance, is more helpfully understood as differencism. And she rightly said that was a challenge for many to embrace. It is a nuance. So when you hear someone using a sexist, bigoted, misogynist, racially intolerant term, they may well just be intolerant per se and a revolting person. But there might be something else going on, particularly in a group dynamic. You've got to remember, this wasn't some pig-headed person in a small and isolated setting at work, socially, out in the street. This was a confrontation between mass tribes who felt threatened one against the other and reacted in an intolerant way, and then it disappeared. Now, we weren't sure about our views on this, so we tested them. And we went out interviewing people, and we interviewed MPs, police officers, and we interviewed 4 Muslim Lebanese important people at the time. We expected our views to be contested and challenged. And Mark and I were astonished when everyone came out independently and separately with the same view. MPs, police officers, Muslim leaders. But it was the Muslim leaders that really I found almost confronting, because it wasn't what I was expecting them to say. And all of them said, we grew up on Cronulla Beach. We never experienced racism. I said, what do you mean you grew up on Cronulla Beach? It was unbeknownst to me, probably not so Mark, who's been around there for years. For decades, kids and then parents and then his grandparents, every Sunday they go to Cronulla Beach. And each of them we'd say, did you ever experience in all these hundreds and hundreds of visits to Cronulla anything unpleasant? No. Was anyone nasty to you? No. Did anyone ever say anything racial? No. Was this a racist event? No. And Mekalala, who you Google her, she was that wonderful human being that invented the bikini, and part of what I call East meets West and the rapprochement, where a whole lot of Muslim men and women were engaged to become lifeguards in Cronulla. And we asked her particularly whether she thought Caucasian and Lebanese men had been driven by racism. And she replied, no, there's always an underlying issue, whether it's an anger problem, whether it's feeling unsatisfied in your life. I wouldn't say racism is at the forefront of somebody's life. Now this, Gerard and colleagues, this finding of ours is the most challenging for many, because you go to the footage and the scholars say what Goodwin and Scully are saying can't be right because we've watched an alternative view on TV and we've seen the pictures in the newspaper. And our answer to that is truth must rest upon facts and evidence, not upon an assertion based on spliced and angled media. So we say the truth that's out there is inaccurate, unfair, unsustainable, and what we've endeavoured to do is present the real truth about what happened and why it came and went, and it's never been seen since. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
First occasion on which I've ever been able to instruct a former police minister or a police commissioner to be on time, and they both were on time and 15 minutes each to the minute, so well done. So we've got copies outside of the Cronulla Riots, the inside story, by Carl Scully and Mark Goodwin. I'm sure they'll be happy to sign them. So we'll start questions and discussion. If you both come up here and stand in the middle and talk towards the end, I'll lead off and then you pass the microphone between yourselves. Looking back, I recall writing about, and I've found again, that shortly after the Cronulla riots, in the Guardian newspaper, Gerard Greer predicted that in the following summer, that is the summer towards the end of 2006, there would be riots all the way from Surfers Paradise to Perth. And of course, as you point out, they didn't happen. But what was the response like? Because I recall people like Scott Morrison, the Liberal member, and Jason Clare, and a Labor member got together, and they got these groups together and they mixed. And so why do you think Gerard Greer was so profoundly wrong?
Oh, thank you. Gerard, I think very early on that was a reasonable assumption. Had we not put 2,000 police and draconian powers in place and that dissent not crushed, it would have been way more violent, and it's unpredictable where it could have gone. But I think the police response very quickly, for example, once we gave police the powers, they were going on to public transport, pulling up people's phones, and if there was any inciting messages, phone confiscated, person arrested. Cars pulling into roadblocks, any weapons on board, confiscated, car taken, men arrested. That went through like a bushfire, and I think the communities too did a fantastic job. You've heard of Jamal Rifi, Jihad Dib, and local commanders like John Richardson, and yeah, Jason Clare and Scott Morrison. There were interfaith prayer meetings, there were rapprochements. I think folks realised in both communities the few hundred that behaved in this way weren't going to define their communities in their thousands. The 200 on the day that did this, and the 200 or 300 young Lebanese men that did this, they weren't going to define a community. There weren't thousands doing these things. That's important. It was a few hundred on both sides. Let's put it in perspective. And I think that's why. It just didn't get the resonance and the volume of protest and action that some people think it does when you say, I saw it on TV.
Look, I agree with Carr, but I think also that the reason it never came and went is because not only the police operations, but I think that there's a Well, look, I can tell you that it's been said to me 100 times at Cronulla. I think it's a wake-up call we needed, and I think there's far more searching now for sameness and than differencism. And I don't think, unless there is another great big spark, that like the assault on the lifeguards, there could always be another incident. But I think that it came and went for those reasons.
Great talk. Not so much a question. I was a Shire person, and I knew quite a few people in the Shire. Just prior to the riots, Darook Park, which is a wonderful park, where families used to go weekends and picnic and whatever. And these people started to move into Darook Park, and they would come in and sort of urinate on their picnic baskets. And they drove these people out of Darook Park, and they started to take it over on a weekend. And that was just prior to the more and more people moving into the beach area, and they thought that they were sort of really moving in. Just a comment.
Well, Mark, have you heard reports of that? You heard reports of that effect?
Oh, not that particular incident, but I can assure you, and I know from the Cronulla locals, I've spoken to hundreds of them, that this sort of thing that you're describing was very, very out of control down there. There was a very, very big push by some very unsavoury people to dominate that spatial domain, and I think I've mentioned the behaviour that, and this is why we say that I don't believe that it was a full-on racist event. I think you need to peel back the onion layers and look at the real causal factors, which was about the behaviours that you're describing.
Actually, funny story. Just the other day, I met a young lady. I think she's 23 or 24. She said, "Oh, you're Carl Scully." I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Do you know I caused the Cronulla riots?" I said, "Oh, did you?" And she said when she was 3 on North Cronulla Beach, one of these small groups kicked sand in her face, and her mum got so upset and she had a go at them and then cleared out and went and complained to the lifeguard, which then apparently led to the assault and da-da-da-da. And I said, "Oh, so nothing like extrapolating." I said, "Oh, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've always wanted to know what really happened."
So it was started by a 3-year-old. Great.
Thank you both. Both of you touched on this. It's really the media. So much of our reality now, especially with 24/7 streaming, whatever, private media, whatever, our reality is distorted every minute of the day. I agree with what you're saying. The goodies and baddies were determined by whoever reported it, the ABC or whatever. What can be done about this? I mean, why is it that it's taken this long for you to put into the public arena the full story? Can you both describe how we can manage the media better and what might have happened differently had we been able to?
I think if I knew the answer to media management, I'd be in far more money than what I'm on now. But look, I can tell you from a police officer's point of view, it is very, very difficult to manage the media. They seem to act as a pack. They develop a pack mentality. For instance, on the day at Cronulla, the pack decided that it's all over now, we'll go home, and missed the main event. And therefore we're left with this skewed footage of the only incidents during the day. And then these other attacks were so random and so mobile, they've got no footage. There was a few what they call stringers on overnight. There was so much distance and tyranny of distance between them, they captured no footage. So we're left with this completely one-sided, skewed imagery that then academics have grabbed on, and the story and the narrative has been written down that path ever since. But how to control that, it's a very, very difficult machinations of the media, and certainly I know in the police we have our own, I don't belong to them anymore, but they had a very big media unit, and it was a massive struggle to try and contain and manipulate stories every day, because like you switch on the news every day, top 5 articles, you'll see police in some shape or form. Someone's been arrested, someone's been shot, there's a police pursuit, there's someone dead, there's a murder, there's a kidnapping, there's all sorts. You know, they are very, very attracted to police stories, and it's I have found extraordinarily difficult to manage.
Just to add, we actually have written a chapter or part of a chapter, Did the Media Cause the Riots? And my answer is a complex question with a complex answer. And the answer we gave is yes and no and maybe. And we included social media, and there's about 270,000 social media texts, no question, that contributed. Did Alan Jones cause the riots? No. Did he help? No. Did he stir up and incite discontent, etc.? Yes, he did. But like the Muppets, remember Statler and Waldorf? All his audience were all up in the bleachers cheering and hollering on. They didn't turn up. So, Alan, if you're out there, yes, you didn't help, but you didn't cause it. And no one turned up to the courts and said, Your Honour, I didn't do it because Alan made me do it. But your point, I mean, it's very hard because the revenge attacks were in the dead of night, cowardly in the dead of night. There just wasn't the footage. And it's simplistic. And that's why, genuinely, naively, because I've had a few years at uni, decades ago, I used to scholarship. I thought it would help. It didn't. Lazy. And the notion that the footage proves Sutherland is full of racists, to me, I conclude is racialist. But I don't, and I wish, got to remember, I stood in front of the media firing squad. I feel for Albo at the moment because I've been there. I've sat through them day after day. And the pack just decides on a story. And there's no moving them. Thank you.
What's the relevance of this story today, and particularly in the context of some of the things that have happened since the Gaza war outbreak, and in the context of some of the things we've seen from European cities, where we understand in places like Paris and Malmo there are no-go zones where fire trucks won't go without a police armed escort. And so is there something relevant for Australia in all of that?
My response, relative to a whole lot of things going on in the world now and what has gone on in the world, I know this sounds a bit twee, but we've got a great country. And each of those conflicts have their own set of circumstances. And tempting as it may be, we're not experts on any of those riots or any of the conflicts in the Middle East. And I know some have chosen to draw parallels and to draw conclusions. Some who may be interested in getting some inspiration for ideas out of a book may get some solace because we do talk about tribalism, but it's a way more peaceful dislocation of tribes in Sydney than anything we've seen, even in Britain recently, and some of those conflicts in Paris and certainly in the Middle East. I think the principles of disregard for the other and why might be of assistance, but some of those conflicts are exponentially off the chart compared to what we had. So we've endeavoured to answer questions about a particular conflict that we're just not equipped to be. We're nowhere near an expert. We're the two players that were charged to quell dissent and restore order. We did it, and that's what we've written about. I don't know whether you...
A great book, congratulations. It's very well researched from what I've read. A question. You've mentioned tribalism. How come your professional and political careers effectively ended over the handling of the Cronulla riots, and the tribalism both within the Labor Party and the police force ended up being a negative for you both?
Thank you. Only a true Labor believer would ask me that. I'll try and be succinct. We do deal with it. Yes, I had a great political career, as Michael would know. I met him in Young Labor and Mary subsequently, and we've known each other for decades through the Labor family. All I ever wanted to be was, to be honest, a Labor leader, and certainly, if not, a senior minister for a sustained period of time. Very quickly, the report came out, and I was very concerned that it had not involved any degree of consultation with the affected senior commanders. And it started being leaked by people I don't know. It was a draft, the Commissioner agreed it was a draft, and the author of the report basically said it was finished, therefore I'd misled Parliament, which I hadn't. Swirling media, an impatient and Premier that, in the face of some negative media, sacked me. And If you look at the last 50 years of ministers who were sacked for things, it is the least offensive. It was simply media getting carried away. Sorry, no, I didn't get a bottle of Grange, but media getting carried away with whether or not the report was finished enough to be released. That was it. And Michael, I'll be honest, it was devastating and took a while to accept. Of course, I'd expected to be in that job for years hence, and suddenly I wasn't. But I still had 12 years, and a big motivator of the book was to set the record straight. Firstly, on what happened to me. I had never misled Parliament, once, twice or ever, and the Premier never sacked me for misleading the Parliament. It was because of the media turbulence. He made it clear. He even said to me, we've got an election coming up. If it was after the election, I wouldn't have worried about it. But in Mark's case, I'll let you...
Now, before we go to Mark, for those who are not in the room, so the Michael here is Michael Eason. Okay.
Oh, so
Yep.
Michael.
Oh, hey. Look, in the book, we outline a report that was put out into police performance. Certainly, we offer a contra-narrative, is probably the best word, to findings that were in that. And probably all I'm prepared to say at this point is that it reached to a point that it was untenable for me to remain in that environment, mostly for health reasons.
Perhaps I could just...
That's about all I can say, unfortunately.
Yeah, sorry. The performance of police... Whoops, yep. The performance of police and what they did and what happened to a number of the leaders is inversely proportionate to what should have happened. This guy lost his career. Craig Campbell, who saved the lives of those two guys on Cronulla railway station, almost charged with using excessive force. And John Richardson, the commander out at Campsie Lakemba, who did a huge job with the Lebanese Muslim community restoring order, he gets defamed on ABC Four Corners and on 2GB, driven out. So, Michael Eason, great question. The performance inversely proportionate to the results. I never expected medals for what I did. I think I did a darn good job in organising the law enforcement response. I just didn't expect to be sacked for it. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you ever find out what the families of the young men involved thought about it on either side? Were they encouraging them? Did they try to dissuade them? Did you ever have any idea about any of that?
Interesting, when we interviewed Jamal Reefi, he said that, and he provided enormously beneficial management of the intertribal conflict. He said when the convoys came back, it was all agreed across the Lebanese Muslim community in southwest Sydney. They weren't heroes, they were cowards and criminals. And he said that resonated across the Lebanese Muslim community. And I think that had a terrific impact, that these were young men who just lost their cool and went crazy. And I suspect if they were interviewed now, they'd be embarrassed, as a lot of the Caucasian young men very quickly, in the cool light of day and sobered up, didn't know what got into them. But I think that was certainly through Jamal Reefi, but I can't give a direct answer to that.
Only that, and it might contradict a little bit, so excuse me, but I worked a lot of years in the Bankstown area as a detective there for 10 years. And some of the people that were attending Cronulla Beach that were involved in these build-up and incidents were from crime families that were well known to the police. And their parents were well known to police. So I can't really expand on that, but not all of them, but a great deal of the troublemakers and core of those groups were very well known to us in the western suburbs. And I think they were there with their total family and parental consent. But that's not I should clarify, that's certainly not the wider community, because as Carl pointed out, I know for a fact also that the wider community were embarrassed by their actions just as much as what the Caucasian people of Cronulla were embarrassed by the bogans and the idiots that turned up on the day and behaved the way they did down there. So that's...
Just a quick point, Gerard. There's 2 chapters in the book. Why was it mostly men? Interesting. Have a read. Why was it mostly Lebanese Muslim men? And we deal with that in a much wider context. It's worth a read. It's very well written, that part.
They wrote different chapters. It was one of yours, was it?
Gentlemen, just one quick comment. That I understand that one of the reasons why the response from the Islamic boys stopped was because mums took away their car keys. That was one of the things I heard. But more seriously, I think that what you've raised has got enormous importance and relevance to what's happening in Sydney at the moment. We've commented here in this venue before on the lack of response by the police for a lot of the agitation that's going on, and it's going to get further out of hand if the police do not respond. It's obviously a political question as well as an operational question. But anyway, you might like to comment. Thank you.
I get asked, and the answer is no. I'm not going back.
Yeah, likewise.
We're done. But once again, we can only comment. You know, I hate to use this example, but I read a great book many, many years ago. It was one of the few about Lincoln and the decisions he made based on the material before him, not what he should have done and shouldn't have done. And in a much more microscopic example, we had material before us and we responded. So what leaders do following us, I can no more make calls on that than anyone in this room. And it's very easy to be an armchair general, and we try not to be. Particularly I get asked, what about politician this and minister that? And I go, I'm not the minister. I can't make a call, and I shouldn't. I think, Mark, I'm assuming you'd probably be the same for Police Command.
Yeah, I think a deeper issue in the underlying 2 questions now from the front of the room. Look, we do look in the book at the Lebanese concession of the 70s and the problems that caused. And there's certainly the second and third generation of
Can I interrupt
some
you
of those.
there? I think you should explain the Lebanese concession.
Okay, sure. But we do have a look at that in the book. But we can't draw any parallels to what's occurring now from what we have said in the book, because we know some of the participants and so forth that were involved at that time. But I feel there may be some attempts to draw a nexus with it in the current environment, but it's not something we're qualified really to speak on.
Okay, I've got a question here from Parramatta, which says, says, tell the speakers very interesting accounts, and what kind of response has there been to their book so far? This woman says she hasn't seen much criticism. So how have you gone?
Oh, just quite positive. I've not had any interest from the left. I thought I would. They'd say Carl's a social democrat. You know, well, let's get him on. I haven't. We did get contacted by The Guardian with a list of things that academics and so-called leaders had said, and we've not responded to that. But that's not been published. But generally, there seems to be an almost sigh. Thank goodness someone's called this out, that Sutherland Shire is an enclave of bogan racists based solely on videography and photographic evidence, and the far worse revenge attacks not being called out and being lost to history. So mostly it's thank you and let's move on with an honest account. But I suspect my comrades of the left, Michael and Mary, they probably don't want to hear the challenge to the notion that only white people can be racist. I think that's will be a challenge to some, because it's a convenient truth. No?
You spoke for a minute about why it was just the young men, and all I could think about was West Side Story. And in a funny sort of way, the disturbances now have gone way beyond gang warfare. And what you had in Cronulla was more what you described. Hotheads on both sides, who were all young men having it out. And then it got blown into this huge thing about, multiculturalism and breakdown in standards and all the rest of it. But to some extent, what you just described, it's very much like West Side Story. You had a gangland war of kind.
I think when you talk to folks, once again, Mark's probably better placed, but certainly I've spoken to a lot of folks, a lot of biff going on over a lot of years. And the gentleman at the back, spot on, a lot of simmering biff and stuff that wasn't quite bad enough to call the cops, but occasionally they were called. A lot of angry and upset dads and boyfriends with misogyny and preening and male biffness that just got out of hand and then got a bit more aggressive. But compared to, as I said, overseas, it's pretty mild, I think.
No, I agree with that. Anyway, I'll just add a fun fact that I've seen it numerous times. I agree with what the analogy you draw, and that the reason I've seen it so many times is because my young niece was the lead female star in it. So look her up, Julie Goodwin, and she's not the chef.
The West Side Story. I haven't heard that mentioned in a while.
And of your colleagues, following up the other question I had, your colleagues in politics or the police force made any comment on your book?
Well, generally, we got a couple of hundred people to the launch, and there were retired and current MPs on both sides of the House. There were a couple of ministers and shadow ministers, former shadows. We had a lot of police officers, and we've had overwhelming support for the story we've endeavoured to tell, both about our careers, what really happened, the frightening intelligence, and what I call the political and sociological analysis of tribal conflict in that context. We've had pretty good feedback, I'd be fair to say.
Yeah, look, from the police perspective, and I've actually had some unsolicited, very strong feedback. It's about time the truth was told. I've heard that from Cronulla residents and Sutherland Shire people. I've heard it from police officers that were there on the day. And involved in the revenge attacks. So far, so good as far as the feedback, as far as the most overwhelming of which is it's about time the truth was revealed and is out there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Mark and Craig. As Michael Eason said, it's an important book. It's very well researched, and it was great that both could come along tonight and talk about their book. Their papers will be published in time in the Sydney papers. They're copies of the Cronulla Riots, the inside stories outside. I'm sure our authors are happy to sign them, but for tonight it being right on 7 o'clock. We're over, all and out, and well done to both of you. Thank you. Well done.